After e4, c5, knight f3, d6, bishop b5 check, bishop blocks. This is the variation we're looking at today, with the one with bishop blocks, bishop takes with check, queen takes. We've seen a few of these videos already, but we're going to go through something we haven't seen at all, obviously. Otherwise, what would be the point of making this video? c4 comes now, as we all know. And now I'm going to go through knight to f6 extensively in this video, and there's going to be some other videos as well. Knight f6 is an immediate move targeting this pawn. But before we do that, let's quickly mention this line. Knight to c6 comes now. We've gone through this a lot in previous videos. Feel free to go and check them out before you watch this one. The move now to continue, as we know, is d4. And after take, here there's like a lot of other things that can happen. A move we need to explore is the following: knight to e5, attacking the pawn in c4. This is actually quite popular. It happens a lot, and you need to know what to do. One of the reasons why I'm doing this video is because it was happening against me as well a lot. So obviously I wanted to know what to do against it, because I found it quite annoying. I didn't want to play the pawn to b3 to defend the pawn, because I felt like this diagonal was going to be a bit weak for me. I've often had problems with that, but actually b3 is the best move, so you have to play this. After knight f6, knight develops, g6, bishop develops. It's basically very symmetrical. These are all best moves both by white and by black. It looks pretty nice. Anyway, now white goes on with queen to e2. Is a useful move in this type of setup with the bishop. It defends the bishop, basically. You never have to worry. And the swap by black taking this bishop will be unfavorable, because when you take back with the queen, your queen will become the new fianchetto bishop, and the opponent is likely to castle short side, because it's a Sicilian game. Your opponent is not going to castle long side unless he's crazy. So castling here and then giving up this bishop for this one would be really bad. So let's go on castle, and now white's best move is to castle long. What are the quick mentions that I'm going to keep making about this line before we go on to the main line of this video? Well, how does black start an attack? Black typically starts an attack with a6, b5 in this type of setup, and obviously has to bring the rook this side, and so on. The bishop is actually a strong bishop, the fianchetto bishop, because there's no pawns on the dark squares, no white pawns either, so this bishop is ready to become a monster. Just as strong as Ivan Drago against Rocky in Rocky 4. So let's go on with a few thematic moves here. a6, and white goes on with f4. So it's one of those Sicilian games where basically one player rushes the attack against your king, and you do the exact same thing. You see this against, when you play against the Najdorf. I don't play against the Najdorf because I play bishop b5, I play Moscow, and that's what you play as well if you're watching this channel. But it's just very similar. So f4 comes now, and the knight has to move. Knight to c6. The game is in the control of the white player, just so you know. I forgot to mention that. Now white takes this knight. This is crucial because it reduces black potential initiative. If black takes with the queen, then knight to d5 is surrendering forever the control of the square, the attack over the square d5 by black. So black is threatening knight e7, winning the game. If black swaps, then you take back, you got an incredible pawn chain. And remember, when your opponent has a pawn in d6 and a pawn in e7, if you can have a pawn in d5, the control over the square e6 is forever, and black can never really push e6, because then you can take, and then you're going to have a lot of pressure over d6. You just leave it like this, like so, forever. So in this position, what happens if black takes the knight in c6 with the pawn? Okay, e5. And the pawn is pinned in d6, so that's also trouble. This variation is also trouble. The pawn cannot take, obviously, so after knight to g4, h3 attacks the knight, knight to h6, and now g4. And this knight is never going to go anywhere. Nowhere. It's completely lost. It will not move again. It's not lost, but it won't move again at all. So after these moves now, let's play a bunch of best moves by black, and then see how to respond, and then we can move on to the main topic of the video. Queen to c7 is the best move. Get it out of the attack of the rook, the pin. So now we take, and now f5. This is beautiful, because either black takes the pawn, free pawn, but then it allows us to play rook g1, pinning the bishop, then we can move the knight. and the king will be open, and obviously it's not advisable. If black does that, you completely winning. So let's go on with a few moves. Rook f2 8 attacking the queen. Queen to f3. Rook to c8. And now just king to b1. Prophylactic moves. These are all best moves. And after queen to e7, the rook comes into the support of the queen. The idea is obviously now to win the game with f6. And after queen e3, all of these are best moves. f6 comes anyway. And that's beautiful. Because now this knight is still paralyzed and this bishop is as well. So after bishop to f8, the bishop shouldn't go to h8 because then it's really, you know, it's even stupider move. But bishop f8, the bishop now does have some squares to potentially go to. Now the bishop goes to c1, attacking the queen and also attacking potentially the knight, depending on what happens. If queen takes, rook takes, you're just doing better. You've been doing better than black forever in this game. This pawn can never be taken, and this knight is misplaced forever. Rook to e6, and now white plays rook to d3. The idea is now to involve the king. The thing is, and what you need to remember, what you also remember if you watch the previous videos of this saga of the Moscow, is that in the bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, c4 game, the thing is that the white player takes control of the square d5 forever, and it's unstoppable, it's unpreventable. Black can never push. Also, that's one of the reasons why white plays king to b1, right? You want to get this out of the potential pin of the rook. Black can never push this pawn without losing it for free. So after rook to e8, it looks like a completely normal endgame, but you're actually completely winning here. King to c2, and there's no moves by black. c5 will surrender d5 forever, knight d5. The knight will be sitting in the square to the right side of the father, and it will be basically the new ruler of the universe. So black can't allow that. a5. Okay, bishop to d2, literally messing around. You see, the knight can't move, the bishop can't move, the pawn d5 can't move, a4 will just be taken, c5, okay, knight to d5. Look how scary that knight is. a4 now as the only possible move by black that can make sense. Well, you take it. You don't have to worry about the rook being able to go to a8 to attack the pawn because knight c7 wins material. You also have to worry about the rook being able to do that later. You might wonder what if black plays something else like rook to e2 to avoid the fork and then plays this move. Then you're always going to have time to play a5 and the bishop is defending the rook. I know it's pinned, but then you can play rook a3. There is absolutely no counterplay whatsoever because these two pawns c5 and d6 cannot move. So let's restart so that we can go to the main topic of the video. Bishop check, bishop blocks. Okay, this is what we're looking at. Okay, bishop takes, queen takes. In previous videos we went through knight takes back or knight d7. There's a lot of stuff we're talking about. Go check them out in my channel. Anyway, white goes on with c4. And now we're looking at the immediate knight f6 move. This is the topic of this video. Okay, obviously we protect the pawn with knight c3. And now we're going to look at two main options, which one of them is e5, a type of scenario that we haven't explored at all in this saga. And the other one is the more normal g6. Okay, so with g6 you play d4. And the funny thing is that now it's just too late for black to transpose into something that we've seen before, because after knight c6 now, if that happens, there's also a possibility to take the pawn in d4. We're going to see that in a minute. White now plays d5. Okay, this is one of those positions where you don't really know what to do. If you never think, you think as a Sicilian player, I mean as a white e4 player, you think when you play against Sicilian, you always believe that the pawn in c5 will take in d4. Sometimes they don't do it, and you shouldn't get upset. When they don't do it, at least in this type of setup, remember, you play d5, you're gathering more space, you're accumulating more space in your favor. This is not meant to be good for black. Black can't play knight d4 because you got two attackers to that square. And now let's look at two options, knight to b4 or knight to e5. Knight to b4, you play a3. The knight has to go to a6, only square. And now e5 attacks the knights. Very aggressive opening. There's a couple of options here, but none of them is really good. I mean, knight g8 will be terrible. White's best move is to just castle, and white is completely winning. You're gonna take the pawn in d6. The pawn in e5, by the way, can never be taken, because after take, then knight in e5 is just way too strong to be real. You're gonna play rook e1, queen f3, checkmate very soon. If after e5 black plays knight to h5, seems to be making sense. Now h3. The idea is to play g4, which wins the knight. Well, it doesn't win the knight because then knight g7, but it becomes a joke. The knight in fianchetto and the bishop becomes undevelopable. But, by the way, that's actually the only move by black. The knight will be able to go to f5 after all, so how do you take it? So now white's best move is castle. And after knight to f5, you actually take the pawn in d6, which is weird. Of course, taking runs into the checks and so on. What happens after knight to d6? It looks like, you know, the knight's attacking this pawn, and now everything's kind of solid for black. But in reality, knight e5 now. And it's a terrible situation. Queen cannot just go back to d8 because queen a4 wins the game. Boom! The queen cannot interpose, it's the only piece, but then you got checkmate, and there's nowhere else to do, nothing else to do. So after knight to e5 attacking the queen, queen c7, but still queen to a4, check. And after the king moves to d8, you can play knight to b5. The game is over. You're attacking the queen, and it's not like this could be avoided, like, because okay, what are you gonna do? Queen moves, but then you can swap this knight, and then you can play knight f7 and then win the rook. If the knight takes your knight, then knight f7 is now available. The knight is no longer protecting f7. This is check. If the king goes to e8 to attack the knight, then the knight in b5 is pinned. You don't have to wait. You don't have to worry about recapturing it. You will recapture it because now you can win the rook for free, and the knight will be taken the next move. If the king instead goes to c8 after the check, well then you take the knight with the pawn and an attack on the other knight, whilst the attack on the rook remains. You are winning in material. So let's make a recap just to familiarize better. So d6. Bishop check, bishop blocks, take, c4, and now knight f6 immediately, knight c3. Okay, so we're looking at g6. Alright, d4 now comes right now, and knight c6. What happens now when the black player doesn't take the pawn in d4? Okay, you push, and we're looking at knight b4, pawn attacks the knight goes back to the only square, and now e5. Two options that we haven't seen. One of them is pawn takes, the other one is knight g4. So I'll start with pawn takes here. Now obviously we play knight e5 with an attack on the queen, and then when the queen moves, queen a4 check. So it's a pattern, this one, to remember. Knight to d7 is now possible, so what to do now? Okay, castle. And after bishop g7, I'm pretty sure the bishop will be extremely happy to take this knight. White plays rook to e1. And funny how whatever black does now, white's position is like evaluated as if white was up a piece. Taking the knight for real, okay, rook to e5. And when black castles, black doesn't have any defense over the dark squares. White does have the dark square bishop, so you can imagine what's going to happen now. White's best move now, obviously, rook e2 to protect it against the attack of the knight. And look, think about it. This knight, even going to c7, doesn't have any possibility to go to b5 or e6 or d5. So it's kind of really misplaced. Not even knight b8, knight c6 works. Nothing works. So black will have to move this knight to f6. And now white plays bishop to g5. The idea is to bring the other rook to e1 and attack e7, trying to provoke e6, which will be very damaging, because of the knight is pinned and there's no defense over the dark square, so you can play knight e4, winning the game immediately. So that's not something that the black player might want. So let's see what happens after queen to d6. I'm pinning the whole thing. White plays knight to b5, and the queen will have to move again. Let's say queen to b8. Potential idea of playing knight to c7 and get rid of our very strong knight. But I mean, what happens next? The rook is reaching the 7th rank. If instead the queen goes to d6, then she will have to admit wasting time. And now white goes on with rook a to e1. So in this position, earlier we went through bishop takes knight, clearly not a good option. Let's look at two other options. Knight to b8, trying to play this game, since that knight is completely out of it. Okay, bishop to g5 comes now, and it's funny because there's no fork here. You got a lot of pressure on e7. You want to be able to take e7, and then when you move the knight, there's gonna be undiscovered attack on the queen, pinning it. So f6 now. Okay, taking d7. You got a discovered attack threat, so black can't really take the bishop. After queen takes, with a desperate attempt of unpinning and finally starting a normal game, what to do now? Bishop to f4. And you got the idea of playing knight to b5 and also knight to c7. What happens after this swap? Not a problem, take back. And let's say, for example, knight to d7, right? Finally developing. Bishop to d6 wins the game. Even if black protects the pawn in e7, you can still take if you want and play d6 afterwards, and you're gonna have an amazing passed pawn. If instead, let's say, black doesn't play knight to d7 and plays b6, stopping us from taking the pawn in c5. Okay, rook to e6, infiltrating here, exploiting the e6 weakness because of our d5 pawn. So rook e6, king to f7 in order to develop the rook, for instance. These are just sample moves. You're completely winning the game here. Rook to e1, and now rook to e8 to protect that pawn. This knight can't develop. Okay, knight to c3 comes now, and after knight to d7, knight to b5, knight to f8 attacking the rook, but now it's too late because white has amazing development and has played perfectly enough to be able to afford this sacrifice. Rook takes e7. Boom. The thing is this is check, and if the king moves, we're going to win the rook and the game. If rook takes, the knight just kicks the king away from the protection of the rook, and we're going to infiltrate our rook in here. We've got a pass pawn, and we're winning this endgame. So back in this position, we mentioned how bishop takes is wrong, knight b8 is wrong. What happens after f6? Just kicking out the knight and try to play a normal game. Okay, white plays knight to d3, and after castle, did the black player manage to play a normal game? No, because bishop e3 reinforces the attack over the square c5. And what to do now? If the queen goes to c7, for instance, knight to f4, too strong. It's threatening to go to e6, and the funny thing is that it's going to go to e6 no matter what. If instead of queen to c7, just to make an example, black plays g5, stopping the knight from going to that unbelievable square. Okay, rook a to d1, and after rook to c8, queen to c2 comes now. So black playing the most solid moves. Still, look at the chain, look at the pawn chain. This is a reverse pyramid. The white player is attacking e6 forever. And yes, it's true that the black player is managing to reduce the damage so far as much as possible, but it's also killing. Look at the bishop, the black bishop. Look at this knight, is not going anywhere. If it does, then knight takes will be very easy to see. Rook to e8, okay, knight to b5, attacking the pawn in a7. After queen to b6, white wins material with b4. Too much pressure over c5. If instead of queen b6, for instance, black plays rook to a8, h4 should do the job, obviously. Black should not be taking this pawn because black has no way to get the pieces to play this side. The rook doesn't move diagonally, the queen doesn't jump across the pawns, and that's going to open the king completely, and also allow knight f4. When knight f4 becomes possible, just play it. If black plays h6, okay, then well, f4, and we should be able to take until knight f4 becomes possible. So let's make a recap. Bishop takes, queen takes, c4, knight f6, immediate, okay, knight c3, g6, d4, and after knight c6, the variation where they don't take the pawn, pawn to d5, knight b4, a3, knight is misplaced in e6, and now e5, very aggressive. We need to look at the variation knight g4, which is the only one we haven't looked at, Okay, we take the pawn in d6, and this can be taken in two different ways. If black takes with the queen, God knows for which reason, knight b5 attacks the queen. Very similar scenario to what we've seen already. Queen d8 is met with queen a4, game over. You can't stop this. If black plays queen to d7, obviously to stop the discovered attack, but now h3 comes. And when the knight moves back, then you can play knight e5. And the queen will have to leave that square. And you have the discover check, which should result in checkmate very soon, now that I think about it. So in this position, after knight b5 and the attack on the queen, if the queen goes to b8, queen a4 does the same thing, so there's no much difference. And obviously knight b5, queen d7 to stop the whole thing. Okay, h3, knight f6, queen to a4. And now you're threatening knight e5 winning the game, because as soon as the queen moves, you're going to have the double discover check, whatever you want to call it. And let's look at this idea. The best engine move will be this one, knight to d5, putting more defense over the square, c7. But as you can see, this drops material. So that is the best thing. This is what the engine does in order for the black player to be able to continue this game without being checkmated right away. But obviously you can take it from here. Okay, so in this position, after knight b4, a3, knight back, and now e5, we're looking at knight g4, and as we said, we have to take the pawn. So earlier we went through queen takes, and that's a disaster. What happens after the pawn takes back? Okay, castle. The king is open, so as soon as the king is, the black king is in such a situation, of course you want to castle and play rook e1. So let's see how things go wrong after bishop g7, for instance. Rook e1 check, king to d8, bishop g5 check. And after f6, bishop h4. The square e6 belongs to the white player until the end of the world. g5, okay, bishop g3. h5, the idea of playing h4, how do we react? Rook e6. Obviously, if h4 comes, then rook d6 pins the queen to the king. The rook is supported by the bishop, so that can't happen. After knight back to e5, it looks like black is doing just fine here, actually. But now bishop takes knight. It's a bit surprising, but you'll see why. The thing is, if black takes with the f pawn, then knight takes the pawn in g5, and the position falls apart for the black player. If black takes with this pawn, it looks like now everything's fine, but white will play knight to e4 with the threat of rook d6, pinning the queen to the king, once again renewing the threat. Obviously bishop f8 to defend that is not possible. You also got knight f6, it's a joke. And if instead black plays king to c7 to stop the whole threat from happening, then, well, it doesn't work, because d6 wins the game immediately. It's check, queen can't take, king can't take. When the king moves, let's say whatever he moves, rook to e7 wins material. Here, well, same thing. There's no way out of this. So in this position, earlier we went through how bad things go with bishop g7. What happens after bishop e7? This may look like a more solid move, but obviously the problem here is that now these squares on the king side, the dark squares on the king side, are weak. So now h3, knight f6, and bishop to h6. And we have managed, either in this position, to remove from the black player the possibility to castle. You see, the king can't castle through check, obviously. So after the king castles this side, rook to e1 comes now. You also have a threat of knight g5. Rook h to e8, just to make sample moves, queen to d2. The white player is in a much better position. And after knight to g8, attacking the bishop, bishop to f4. White's advantage consists of being able to play knight e4 at some point and put pressure on the d6 pawn. This is a backward pawn and it will be forever. And also the fact that this is a completely useless knight in a6. After king to b8, knight to g5 comes with a threat of taking in f7. And also in h7. This couldn't have been avoided. Let's say, for example, you might think, what about... Okay, well, you can also think, what happens if bishop takes? Then bishop takes. And then we are removing from the board this very strong bishop. Well, it's not a very strong bishop, but it's one of the defenders, minor pieces defending this pawn. So after that's gone and all the swaps, we would be able to play bishop to f4 once again and really go for the pawn in d6, also because we have the possibility to play knight b5 or knight e4. It depends on what black does. So from the start, we need to mention something different now. Bishop check, bishop d7, bishop takes, c4, knight f6 immediately. Okay, knight c3, and now g6, d4. What happens when black does take the pawn immediately? Okay, in this case, it's not a transposition from one of the previous videos because the knight is not in c6 because the black player moved the knight f6 first and left the knight in b8. Now we're going to take with the queen. It looks dangerous because after bishop g7 and castle, this bishop is on a same diagonal of our queen. Black castles. Now the bishop is protected, so it doesn't have to worry about anything. And what happens now? Queen to d3 is the best move. Let's go on with the best moves by both players. Knight to c6. So bishop d2 comes now. The idea is to play b3, knight d5, and then put the bishop in c3. That's what you want to do. Anyway, don't worry about a move like knight to b4, because you can remove the queen to b1, then play a3, the knight has to move again, and then you can put the queen back in d3. So let's not look at that. After rook a to c8, one of the most thematic moves and one of the best moves, obviously, to put the rook on an open file. b3, and after e6, it looks like this time we won't have our tremendous knight going to d5. But now white plays rook a to d1, rook d2, rook f to d8, and now bishop to f4. It's the type of game where you basically remember the crucial point to attack is the square d6. You're going to go for the square d6, you're going to exploit your e pawn and c pawn to potentially play c5 or e5. e5 by black instead. What happens now? Bishop to g5. The idea is to play g3, h4, and then king to g2. That's how you want to play it and just provoke Zugzwang. We are in a very Zugzwangish type of position. There's no much to play without the two players compromising their position. Although white has the upper hand. What happens after h6? Surprisingly, take the knight. Bishop takes back, and now g3. So here you have a possibility to play knight b5 and have loads of pieces attacking d6. Or if black plays a6, you have the possibility to just sit the knight in d5. Will be sitting very well. No worries about a move like queen to h3, stopping our king g2 idea. You simply play queen to e2, and then the idea is to play rook to d2 and rook to d1, and then take this pawn. Bishop going to f7 is not a problem. You play knight d5, and you're threatening to win to capture the bishop, simplify, and then take the pawn d6. You're winning the game. So you don't have to worry about this queen h3 move. It does nothing. If anything, it just wastes tempos. And in this position, what happens after knight to d4? This could be an idea. Okay, knight takes, pawn takes, and now knight to d5, attacking the bishop, and after the bishop retreats, f4 by white, with the idea of playing f5, f6. And that's also unstoppable. This knight is never going to be removed from that square. Okay, one more recap. Okay, check, take, c4, knight f6, attacking the pawn, knight c3, protect. Here there's something I forgot to mention. After g6, d4, and knight c6, so this is the previous variation, d5, we went through all the time through this move with knight b4. What happens after knight to e5? It's a bad move, but it's worth to mention. Knight takes, pawn takes back, so we double up this pawn, and this pawn in d5 is just too strong now. So white now plays bishop to e3, attacking the pawn in c5, e6 to allow the bishop defending it. Doesn't make any sense because you've now produced a potential passed pawn, and if black takes, you can just take back anytime you want. You have a passed pawn. b6 instead. What happens? You play a4. The idea of playing a5 and then take the pawn. This pawn cannot take back because rook is pinning the pawn in a7 and then will be winning this rook for free, but we all know that that's not going to happen. So what are the best moves now? Okay, let's say black plays bishop g7, you play a5. Taking doesn't make sense because then rook can take back, and then after all the castling and so on, both rooks will be attacking this open file. Black cannot allow that. So after castle, queen to a4 comes now. The idea is to swap with this queen. White is happy to do that. Black's best move will be queen b7, because if black takes, then again we have an open file here. We're gonna be controlling it forever. So after queen b7, best move by black, castle. And after knight to g4, attacking our bishop. How do we meet this type of move? We ignore it in this case, because if you can play rook e1, you should do that. Also because the third rank is open. There's no pawn. So after the knight takes, rook takes back, when you move your knight, the rook can go straight into the doubling up plan with the other rook. Okay, what happens to the thematic f5 move? Everyone that plays this type of defense plays f5 at some point. Okay, queen to c6 comes now. And the trade is unavoidable, even though it looks like we're going to get a silly pawn. This pawn like is likely to be very easily defendable, because after c7 you can play knight d5 or knight b5. So let's say take. Okay, now f4 by black. What to do? Bishop to d2. White is winning. White is like evaluated, has been evaluated +3 or +4 or something like that now. There's nothing here. I'm just showing all the moves that you know. Since you follow this channel, I suppose your rating goes anywhere probably like up to 2000 something. So you know what are the moves that your opponent usually play in these positions, and you know you might be very hating some of the opens and defenses, but like in this case you're probably expecting this one, right? f3. Let's see how to deal with that. Okay, take first of all. Now we just take the pawn here. The reason is simple. The rook can't take the pawn in f3 because we'd be winning this rook for free. What happens if rook takes us first? We take, and after rook takes f3, no, not possible, because black is forgetting about this pawn. It's not a weak pawn at all. If the engine preferred to play queen to c6 and favor this swap and force this swap, that's because this pawn is not just randomly thrown there, is just a winning pawn.